There once was a man who loved his wife, though in that age love was a brittle contract, easily voided by death. She was round with child, heavy with hope, when she took to the winter garden with a sapling, a juniper, bitter and evergreen, with needles that prick like conscience. She planted it with bleeding fingers, whispering an oath that if God took this child, he should take her too. Prophecy or curse, the distinction blurs. Within the month she was in her grave, and the tree stood sentinel over her sorrow, drinking it in like rainwater, growing thick and dark. The man, being practical and lonely, took another wife. She arrived with her daughter Marlene, a pale, skittish thing in a heart like a locked box. She hated the sight of her stepson, that golden-haired reminder of a love she could not replace. The boy was blameless, which made him worse. She would watch him at supper, her fingers drumming the wood, calculating the geometry of his absence. The juniper tree watched too, its branches creaking with a sound too much like laughter. The stepmother devised a punishment disguised as charity. She filled a heavy iron-banded chest with apples, the red kind that tempt and poison in equal measure. She told the boy to fetch one for his sister Marlene. The chest lid was oak and iron, thick enough to crush bone. She knew its weight. She waited until he bent over the fruit, his small neck exposed like an offering, his hair catching the light like spun gold. She slammed the lid down. Not with rage, that would have been honest, but with a housewife's efficiency, as if closing a book she'd finished reading. The crack echoed through the kitchen. The boy's body crumpled, but his head rolled across the floorboards, coming to rest beneath the table, eyes still wide with the surprise of betrayal. The stepmother wiped her hands on her apron and looked at the mess, not with horror, but with the irritation of a woman who has spilled milk. She could not have a body on the floor when her husband returned, so she set about a grisly craft project. She lifted the head, still warm, still leaking, and balanced it upon the neck like a pumpkin on a fence post. She wrapped a silk kerchief tight, red as sin, knotting it beneath the chin to hold the anatomy in place. She placed a rosy apple in his stiffening hand, arranging his fingers just so. "Sit up straight," she muttered. "We have company." When Marlene came calling for her brother, she found him seated by the hearth, rigid as a doll. She tugged his sleeve, wanting to play, and the apple rolled from his grasp. His head followed. It hit the floor with a thud that seemed to shake the foundations. Marlene screamed, not the scream of a child, but the raw sound of a soul recognizing abyss. The stepmother was there in an instant, covering the girl's mouth, her eyes gleaming with opportunity. "Look what you've done," the stepmother hissed, her voice honey over arsenic. "Your jealousy, your wicked temper, you've knocked his head clean off." Marlene trembled, believing every word because mothers are law and gods and executioners. The girl wept into her pinafore, accepting the guilt like a communion wafer, while the stepmother smiled behind her hand. "We mustn't tell father," she crooned. "He wouldn't understand your violence, but I know how to fix it. I know how to make it right." The kitchen became an abattoir. The stepmother fetched her cleaver, the one reserved for hog butchering in autumn. She worked with methodical precision, separating joint from joint, the sound like wet firewood snapping. She stripped the flesh from the small bones, humming a lullaby all the while. The blood ran in rivers across the floorboards, pooling in the cracks. She gathered the pieces into a basin, careful as a seamstress, while Marlene watched from the corner, her mind unraveling like a cheap spool of thread. Into the pot he went, with barley and blood and the dark spices that masked the taste of sin. She stirred the black pudding stew for hours until the meat surrendered its memory and the broth grew thick as oil. The scent that rose was not of murder, but of Sunday supper, rich and savory, curling through the house like a serpent. She tasted it, adjusted the salt, and set the table for three, though only two would eat with understanding. The man came home hungry, smelling of field work and honest sweat. He sat to the bowl his wife placed before him, dark, steaming, fragrant. He ate with the enthusiasm of the innocent, slurping, chewing, declaring it the finest meal she'd ever prepared. "What is this?" he asked, smacking his lips. "A family recipe," she said, smiling. Marlene stared at her own bowl, her spoon suspended, while her father reached for more bread to sop the juices, humming contentedly, unaware he was consuming his own lineage. When the house slept, Marlene crept to the kitchen with a sack. She collected what the stew had not taken: tiny phalanges, ribs like ivory combs, the skull with its silken kerchief still tied. She carried them to the garden, to the juniper tree where her stepbrother's mother lay in roots and darkness. She dug with her bare hands, placing the bones in the earth like seeds, covering them with soil and tears. "Grow," she whispered, "please grow." The tree shuddered. From its branches, a sound, not wind, but wings. The juniper berries swelled and burst, and from the smoke and sap arose a bird magnificent and terrible. It wore the boy's golden hair for plumage, his blue eyes for jewels. It sang not the song of sparrows, but of vengeance, the notes dripping with accusation. It circled the grave 3 times, then flew toward the village, leaving behind a trail of ash that smelled of juniper and burning hair. The bird perched upon the goldsmith's sill, its feathers catching the forge light. It sang in a voice that made the metal tremble. "My mother slew me, my father ate me, my sister Marlene gathered my bones." The goldsmith dropped his tongs, entranced by the melody and the horror of the words. When the song ended, the bird demanded payment, not coins, but the golden chain from around the smith's own neck. He gave it freely, as one pays a ferryman, and the bird flew on, the chain dangling like a noose. By the cobbler's door, the bird sang again, its voice staining the leather and the air. The shoemaker listened, his needle frozen in his hand, as the tale of the kitchen, the chest, the stew unfolded in verse. When the final note hung in the silence, the bird held out its claw. "Your red shoes?" it demanded. The shoemaker removed them, for who refuses a profit? The bird took them in its beak, red as the kerchief, red as the apple, and soared toward the mill, heavy with the instruments of justice. At the mill, the bird sang its dirge a 3rd time, and the miller wept into his flour. "What price for this song?" he asked, though he knew. "Your heaviest stone," the bird said. Not just any rock, but the great millstone, round and gray as a grave marker, the kind used to grind wheat to dust. The miller understood. He rigged ropes and pulleys, and the bird took the stone upon its back, impossibly, inevitably, and flew toward the house where supper still stained the tablecloth. The bird landed upon the juniper tree, its branches bowing under the weight of gold and stone. The father came out, drawn by the song he recognized in his marrow. "My son," he breathed. The bird dropped the golden chain around his neck. A gift, a burden. Then Marlene ran out, and the bird dropped the red shoes at her feet. Payment for her innocence, for her hands in the dirt. Finally, the stepmother emerged, her face a mask of suspicion, sensing the reckoning. "And for you," the bird sang, its voice now the grinding of tectonic plates, the stone. It released the millstone. The rock fell, not like a feather, but like God's own judgment, swift and absolute. It struck the stepmother where she stood, driving her through the porch boards, through the earth, crushing her into the dirt until only her hair remained visible like weeds. The ground closed over her with a wet, final sound, and the juniper tree shuddered, shedding its needles in relief. Smoke rose from the grave, not the smoke of cooking, but of transformation. The bones beneath the tree stirred, knitting themselves with threads of light. The bird folded its wings and dove into the earth, becoming smoke, becoming boy. The soil erupted, and from the hole stepped the child, whole and hale, his neck unmarred, his eyes holding the wisdom of the dead. He smelled of juniper berries and vengeance satisfied. Marlene ran to him, and he embraced her, the apple in his pocket, the kerchief in his hand. They lived as people do after the horror. The father wore his golden chain like a scar. The boy grew to manhood with a song in his throat, and Marlene kept the red shoes in a locked box. The juniper tree bore fruit that year, bitter, red, and plentiful. And if you walk past that garden at twilight, when the light fails and the shadows grow teeth, you can still hear the tree singing, harmonizing with the wind, a lullaby for the innocent and a warning for the wicked, the end, or rather the beginning.